In the Disney Pixar movie Up, an old man and a child find themselves wandering the jungle and they discover some talking dogs. And one of my favorite scenes in the whole movie is when the dog is saying, "Oh, this is my name and you ought to meet my master." And then he pauses and spin, "Squirrel!" And then he goes back. And this is a repeated theme where the dogs have some sort of conversation and are instantly distracted by the squirrel. And while this is funny, the joke being that, like, oh, dogs are such simple creatures, we realize as humans we're not all that different. In my household, we just say squirrel as a pointer to whenever one of the kids gets super distracted by something, be it candy or maybe an actual squirrel or something like that. And let's not lie to ourselves, as adults we're pretty much the same way. Today's fallacy is a similar sort of squirrel fallacy where we just get distracted by something that has nothing to do with the argument in question. We're going to talk about the red herring fallacy. Hello, and welcome to Ontology Explained. I'm Casey Hart, philosopher and ontologist, and this is the 6th in the series, something like that now. Order that you watch it in doesn't particularly matter, although I recommend you watch the first episode on what fallacies are. The red herring fallacy is prevalent, both in use and in name. You've probably heard of it, where someone says, "Oh, that's just a red herring." This is what they're referring to. And in this video, we're going to cover its definition and the history of how the term has been used. We're going to look at some arguments that commit the fallacy so you get clear examples for it. And then we're going to look at some more difficult cases. Is it really a red herring fallacy? How does it fit with some of the other fallacies? Let's get into it. The definition is as follows. An argument commits the red herring fallacy when it adds irrelevant information to either distract or sneakily garner support for the conclusion. So the name red herring traces back to an 1807 article by William Cobbett. I'll drop a link down below in the description if you want to find the article that I used to unpack that history. But much like the squirrel scene from Up, this has to do with distracting dogs. So a child didn't want some rabbit to be chased down, so instead he hid some red herring, and the hunting pack went for the herring instead of for the hare who escaped. And the point of this was not just to save the hare, but rather this story was a metaphor from Cobbett to say that we've been focusing too much on Napoleon and international issues instead of looking at the domestic issues that are important back at home. Now, I know nothing else about the details there. Maybe that was a good point. Maybe that was a bad distraction. Beats me. But that's the history, is that we use red pickled herring, something that's strong and then throws people off the scent instead of looking at the thing that they ought to be focusing on. And that's exactly what we have in mind in the red herring fallacy. You've got some argument, it's got some putative conclusion, and instead of looking at things that are relevant to that conclusion, you get distracted by the squirrel. Let's look at a couple of examples. And most of these, I'm going to frame them as like a discussion between two people where you can see the red herring being thrown at the original argument by some interlocutor, but you can easily enough reconstruct the arguments, just a single argument with a red herring located inside of it. So, argument 1. Person A says, "I think you left the door unlocked last night. You were the last one in and it's still unlocked this morning." Person B says, "Well, I'm not the one spending money on overpriced coffee every day." And of course, right? To be clear, this is not emblematic of any domestic disputes I have. I make sure to lock the door at night. Well, actually, my wife locks the door, and she's okay with whatever I spend on coffee, so I think we're fine. The point here is that whether or not one person is spending money on coffee is irrelevant to the truth of the conclusion about who left the door unlocked the previous night. Instead, you're trying to do some sort of blame game, right? And that blame game is distracting from the real core issue at hand. Second argument. Person A. Factory farming causes unnecessary suffering. Animals are raised in terrible conditions, and then they're killed just for humans' gustatory pleasure. And person B says, "That's ridiculous. Humans have been eating meat for thousands of years." Again, I think this is pretty clear. Sure, humans have been eating meat for thousands of years. I don't see any connection yet being drawn between that and whether factory farming is morally permissible. Right? Maybe there's a case to be made there, but as yet, that is just an irrelevant detail. You're appealing to some sort of tradition or history that doesn't have to do with the truth of the conclusion. Factory farming is causing unnecessary suffering. And with those two cases out of the way, let's look at something a little more in the news. And basically, any interview of a politician, you are going to find abundant examples of red herring fallacies. And in the time where Caroline Leavitt is talking about the Epstein files, we just have a treasure trove of them. So let's look at a couple of those.
In transparency, Caroline, why are White House officials then meeting with Representative Boebert in an effort to try and get her to not sign this petition calling for the release of the files?
Doesn't it show transparency that members of the Trump administration are willing to brief members of Congress whenever they please?
So here, right, Leavitt's asked a question about why you pulled Boebert into the Situation Room to answer questions about why she wants to sign this release the files petition. And Caroline responds with, aren't we the most transparent that you've ever seen? Aren't we doing press conferences all the time? Aren't we briefing House of Representatives members whenever they would like to? Right? And of course, that just dodges the question. Instead of providing a specific answer to why they had Boebert there, what was going on, she responds with like counter accusations, and this is absolutely typical. Let's look at another case.
Can you address their substance? Did the president ever spend hours at Jeffrey Epstein's house with a victim?
These emails prove absolutely nothing other than the fact that President Trump did nothing wrong. And what President Trump has always said is that he was from Palm Beach, and so was Jeffrey Epstein.
And again, you can watch these full clips. I'll drop the links below in the description so that you get the entire context. But the question is rather pointed, right? We have these emails that say that Trump spent multiple hours at Epstein's house with a victim who gets named in this discussion as well as Guffrey. But the response from Caroline is not saying yes or no that Trump was at the house, but instead saying these emails just prove that Trump did nothing wrong. He never did anything wrong. And of course, whatever you think about what Trump did that was right or wrong, you can easily see from the logical structure here that whether Trump did anything right or wrong is irrelevant to the specific question that was being asked here. And we can reconstruct these things pretty easily as arguments, right? We have these emails that say that Trump spent hours, therefore Trump spent hours at Epstein's house. And then the response to that is that he did nothing wrong, which is orthogonal, right? So this is an example of a red herring fallacy, when you get a question and you just dodge the question, throw something else at them entirely to distract or hopefully sneakily get some sort of support for the conclusion that you want to be advancing. Now, formulating these as arguments takes a little bit more work and seeing exactly how the red herring is functioning. But at a broad level, I hope you can see what's going on in these kinds of cases. But now let's get into a little more nuance about how we should think about the red herring fallacy as it relates to other fallacies and whether these distractions and extraneous details are always such a bad thing. And the first thing to note, and this is a pet peeve of mine when people say, you committed a fallacy and it was this one, but not this one. Fallacies are not always mutually exclusive of one another. And in fact, many of them are related in some sort of taxonomic hierarchical order, right? The red herring fallacy is the most generic of the distraction or fallacies of relevance. And that means that there are a bunch of more specific fallacies of relevance, and some of those we've already covered on this channel. So for example, an ad hominem fallacy. If you're attacking someone personally rather than talking about the core issue, you are doing a distraction, right? Instead of caring about this argument, I'm caring about, I think you're stupid or something like that. That's a red herring fallacy, but it has a more specific name of being an ad hominem fallacy. And the coffee example we gave earlier was one of those. So if we're trying to debate whether the door was left unlocked or not, and I say, well, you're spending all this money on coffee, right? I'm somehow attacking the character of my interlocutor rather than addressing the issue at hand, usually because I'm insecure that I forgot to lock the door last night, something like that. We also have appeals to a tradition. We haven't covered this as a specific video yet, but in the factory farming case, it functions like this. We're saying we've been doing something for a long time, therefore it's true. Now, the length of time or tradition related with something isn't always a good reason to think that that thing is true, and when it's not, using the tradition is just a distraction from the core issue here. So when we say that factory farming is causing unnecessary suffering, and we push back against that by saying, well, we've been doing it for a long time, you're just bringing up an irrelevant distraction to the case instead of addressing the issue at hand. Another case that we talked about was the straw man fallacy. And a straw man fallacy, as you'll recall, is when you bring up a weakened or weird or bad version of your opponent's argument in order to beat it up and make you look like your position is correct. But of course, that weakened version of the argument is a distraction. It itself is not the thing you're focusing on. You should be focusing on the steel man or the strongest version of your opponent's argument, not some straw man that you built up to destroy. This whole point here is just to say, don't think that if you've committed one fallacy, well, this can't be an ad hominem because it's a red herring. That's not the way it functions. And why do I feel so strongly about this? Some of it maybe dates back to when I was teaching a public speaking class, and the professor who was in charge of that had a fallacies unit, and they were very intent on the correct answer to this one is ad hominem and not red herring fallacy. And I was like, it's both, right? If it's an ad hominem fallacy, it is a red herring fallacy. And because of the way the question was worded, it should have also been okay to say red herring, and that annoyed me. And so that frustration carries on and is expressed here in this YouTube video. Okay. Now, one challenge with red herring fallacies is that once you get used to spotting in them and say, oh, irrelevant details are bad, you might overdiagnose. And so some challenging cases are, it's not always bad or wrong to have some irrelevant details to the logical structure of your argument as part of what you're talking about. You might remember from the video on principle of charity that we want to construct the best version of somebody's arguments, but when you're presenting your arguments in the wild, there are going to be some details in and around the argument that I'm making that aren't strictly necessary. And the question is, am I relying on those details to be some sort of sneaky support or distraction for the argument, or are they just sort of part of the conversation? So I've been accused before of committing some sort of red herring, where let's say we're discussing, I don't know, the factory farming case again or something like that, and say, look, I've been eating meat my entire life, but such and such facts mean that too much of that meat is cruelly achieved by suffering animals and inhumane practices, and the pleasure that I get from eating it isn't worth the harm that comes to those animals. If someone responded to that by saying, whoa, you said you've been eating meat for years, but that's irrelevant to your argument, this is a red herring, right? Well, of course that's not what's going on there, right? I was just including some details as a part of the conversation, but if you wanted to make the strict premise conclusion version of my argument, you could leave that detail out, and that's fine. We don't need to overly obsess about every word that's being said. What we don't want is bad details to sneak in and be distractions or problems for processing the argument in the most truth-conducive way. If I mention that my sweatshirt is blue as part of some other arguments, that doesn't mean that I'm committing the red herring fallacy or the blue herring fallacy. It means that I just provided some detail that was more or less innocuous. That's totally fine. And this gets us to a topic of using rhetoric and rhetorical devices and whether that's okay or not. And honestly, the ethics of this are pretty unclear. So let's give an example. Let's say that you find, I'm trying to convince my children to clean their room. And let's say that I find that I'm much more persuasive after they've had dinner than before they've had dinner. Because when they're hungry, they're cranky and they're not going to buy it, right? All of us know circumstances like this, where we pose an argument to someone makes a difference in how they will interpret it, even if the structure of the argument isn't radically different. Is that wrong? Is it bad? Is it cheating to present your arguments in cases where people are going to be more amenable to the truth? And in some cases, that feels deceptive and bad. In some cases, that feels like just good, smart practice. And I don't think I'm going to resolve the ethics of that issue right here, but the same thing applies to providing additional details. If when I make my argument, telling a story where you can clearly see yourself as one of the characters, or you describe something that might happen, makes the argument more palatable. But strictly speaking, those details aren't necessary for the execution of the logic of the arguments. We could say it's a red herring, but we could also say it's just framing in the argument in a way that makes it easiest for people to digest, understand, and come to whatever they think the right conclusion should be. And ultimately, my stance here is going to be that I want people to have true and correct views that they've formed sort of by rational means, sort of, fully informed. And If you're using rhetoric or details that help accomplish that goal, then great, more power to you. If you are using those details to distract people from the truth or pull them away from things or keep them from evaluating arguments in the best way that they can, then you're doing something fallacious and bad. Remember that red herrings are relative to the argument that is being made. So if we go back and say I want to be a little more charitable to Caroline Leavitt, right, when she responds that Donald Trump did nothing wrong, it's possible that we can say the argument that the reporter made in that second case when she said, in the emails, we see that Donald Trump spent multiple hours with Virginia Giuffre in Epstein's house. And that tells us that Donald Trump did something terribly wrong. Therefore, Donald Trump should be impeached or sent to prison or whatever that argument might be. Then it's very reasonable for Leavitt to respond with, those emails do not say that Donald Trump did anything wrong. They don't accuse him of specific wrongdoing. They don't accuse him of committing assault or anything like that. So if that's what Leavitt is saying, then her point is not a red herring. That would be directly relevant to that specific argument. However, if what we say from the reporter's question is, does it truly say that Trump spent multiple hours at Epstein's mansion with Virginia Giuffre, then Leavitt saying these emails say he did nothing wrong is a red herring and irrelevant to it. So this is where we get to talking about straw mans and proper exegesis of what the arguments are being made. Often it's not clear what the argument is, or there's multiple arguments on the table, and if somebody brings up a detail and you say that's just a straw man, you have to be really careful. Because you have to say, here's the argument that I'm talking about that's being made, here's the detail that you brought up, and that detail is not relevant to the truth of the conclusion of the thing that I'm talking about. Once you say that, once you've specified the argument, then we can make the judgment about whether a red herring fallacy has been committed. And this is especially relevant in politics when you see two politicians arguing against each other and they're dodging back and forth, because often all the politician is thinking, well, who knows what politicians are thinking, but here's a guess. What they're thinking is, I'm better than the other guy. The other guy's bad and I'm good. Right? And if that's always the argument that they're making, then details that say the other guy is bad or I'm good are directly relevant to the argument they're thinking about. But of course, to many of us who are not in politics, but rather watching it and dismayed at how terrible the state of affairs is, we want to say, like, why aren't we getting all of the people who committed, child trafficking into prison? And from that perspective, knowing that other people were also bad is totally irrelevant to the discussion at hand. So, in what I've talked about previously here, and for every other one of these videos on logic or artificial intelligence or fallacies, be clear on what your arguments are, because then you can talk about what the relationship of the premises and conclusion are, and then we can know whether something fallacious has gone on. Let's summarize. Red herring fallacies are arguments where information irrelevant to the truth of the conclusion is used to distract or offer sneaky support for that conclusion or undermine it. And this is a very general fallacy, and we've seen more specific examples already in other videos like ad hominem arguments or the straw man fallacy, and we're going to see more in the ad populum and appeal to tradition and others. Don't be like the dog in Up. Don't go squirrel when there's the truth to be discussed. Be clear on what your arguments are. Make sure that those premises are relevant to the argument's conclusion. And don't think that just because it's so obvious that you're never going to fall for this. We fall for it all the time. So be diligent, be clear, like and subscribe, and I'll see you for the next video. So when I was doing the editing for this video, I was going onto my desktop to grab various pictures, including the one of the squirrel. And I realized there was another file called Squirrel, which was a video, and I looked at it and it brought back happy memories. There was a time, it was like a year ago, when my wife realized that some stuff was being eaten from her garden and she assumed it was like some rabbit or rats at night or something like that. So we set up the motion camera, and what you'll see next is what we captured. A happy distraction.